They burned his ranch at sunrise, and by sunset, they were already too late to fix what they'd done. The fire had eaten through dry timber like it had been waiting years for the chance. Orange light crawling across the open plains, smoke rising in slow, heavy spirals that blurred the horizon into something distant and unreal. And through it all, Elias Boone stood without moving, boots planted in the dust, coat hanging still despite the wind, watching the last of his life collapse into embers. 10 acres of fence line, a weathered barn, a small cabin built board by board with his own hands. All of it gone in under an hour, and not once did he reach for a weapon, not once did he raise his voice. Not even when Sheriff Dalton Crow tipped his hat and gave a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Should have left when you had the chance," Crow said, like he was doing the man a favor, like this was just business. And Elias only nodded once, slow, deliberate, as if the words had already been spoken long before today. The townsfolk lingered just long enough to see him break. But he didn't, and that bothered them more than if he had. A few laughed, low and uncertain, boots scuffing against the dirt as they drifted back toward Red Hollow, telling themselves the silence meant surrender, that a man alone was just a man without options. But silence out here had a different weight, and Elias carried it like something familiar. When the last beam finally gave in and the roof folded inward, with a hollow sigh, he stepped forward through the ash, crouched once, and picked something up from the blackened ground. A thin leather cord, half-burned, a small turquoise stone still intact at the center, its surface catching what little light remained. He turned it once between his fingers, thumb brushing over markings most men in Red Hollow would never recognize, then slipped it into his coat without a word. Nearby, a boy who'd wandered too close kicked at the dirt and found a second fragment, charred but not destroyed, and held it up with curiosity before his father snatched it away, eyes narrowing just a fraction too long. The wind shifted then, carrying the smell of smoke down toward town, settling into the wood and fabric and skin of everyone who had watched the fire like it belonged there. Elias walked past them all without looking up, boots leaving shallow prints in the dust, heading out toward open land where nothing waited and no one followed. Behind him, Crow leaned against his saddle and muttered, "Man's got nothing left." And a few nodded, eager to believe it, eager to close the story before it could open into something else. But as the sun dropped lower and shadows stretched long across the valley, an old man sitting outside the general store watched that trail of footprints fade into distance and said nothing, though his gaze lingered on the ridge far beyond the town line, where the land rose just enough to hide what might be coming. Because 3 years ago, Elias Boone had disappeared without a trace, and when he came back, he never spoke about where he'd been, never explained the scars that weren't there before, never answered the quiet questions that drifted around him like dust in the wind. And now, as the last light of day caught the edge of that turquoise stone hidden beneath his coat, the silence he left behind didn't feel empty anymore. It felt like something waiting to be heard. By the time night settled over Red Hollow, the smell of smoke had worked its way into everything, into the wooden beams of the saloon, into the fabric of coats hanging by the door, into the quiet spaces between conversations where men usually felt safe. But tonight, no one spoke too loud, and no one stayed out too late, because something about the way Elias Boone had walked away did not sit right in their bones. Sheriff Dalton Crow sat at the far end of the bar, turning a glass slowly in his hand, watching the reflection of the lantern light ripple across the surface like water, telling himself it was over, that land changed hands all the time, that a man without witnesses was a man without claim, yet his jaw stayed tight longer than it should have. Across the room, the old man from the general store leaned back in his chair, boots crossed, hat low, saying nothing, but his eyes moved from face to face, measuring the unease that had begun to spread like a second kind of smoke. Outside, the wind shifted again, low and steady, carrying with it a sound that most folks ignored at first, a dull rhythm that blended with the creak of wood and the distant call of night birds. But not everyone missed it. The boy who had picked up the charred fragment earlier sat on the steps outside his family house, turning it in his hands under the moonlight, tracing the faint lines burned into the leather, lines that curved and crossed in patterns that did not belong to anything he had ever seen before. And when his grandfather stepped out behind him and saw it, the old man froze for half a breath too long before taking it gently away. "You found this near the fire," he said, not asking, just stating, and the boy nodded, watching the way his grandfather's fingers tightened around the fragment like it held weight far beyond its size. The old man did not explain, did not need to, because some things out here were not taught with words, they were remembered. He turned toward the dark ridge beyond the town, where the land rose into shadow, and for a moment, his shoulders sagged under something heavy and unseen. "We should have left that man alone," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. Back in the saloon, Crow finally set his glass down harder than intended, the sound sharp in the quiet room, drawing a few glances his way. "He is gone," Crow said, voice steady but edged, as if saying it out loud might make it more true. "And tomorrow, that land gets cleared for use." And a few men nodded, quick and eager, clinging to something solid, something simple. But simplicity had a way of slipping through fingers out here, especially when the land itself started to feel like it was listening. Sometime past midnight, the first horse in the livery began to shift, restless without reason, hooves tapping lightly against wood, then another, then three more, until the entire row stood alert, ears forward, eyes fixed toward the same distant direction. No storm rolled in, no lightning split the sky, yet the air carried a tension that pressed against the chest like altitude, thin and hard to breathe. Far beyond the last fence line, where Elias Boone had ridden without looking back, the horizon held steady under starlight, but just at the edge of sight, something moved that was not wind and not shadow, something patient, something deliberate, and though no one in Red Hollow could yet see it clearly, the silence that followed was no longer empty, it was gathering. The first light of morning came slow and pale over Red Hollow, stretching across rooftops and hitching posts like it was unsure whether to stay. And for a few quiet minutes, the town almost felt normal again, as if the unease of the night had been nothing more than tired minds playing tricks on themselves. Men stepped out onto porches, boots heavy on wooden planks, breathing in air that still carried the faint trace of smoke, telling themselves a new day meant a clean slate, that whatever tension had settled over them would burn off with the rising sun. Sheriff Dalton Crow stood near the edge of the main street, hands resting on his belt, eyes scanning the open land beyond the last building, expecting to see nothing but empty distance. And for a moment, that is exactly what he saw. The ridge stood quiet under the early light, the same as it had every day before, and a few men let out low breaths they did not realize they had been holding. "Told you," one of them muttered, forcing a half-smile that did not hold, just nerves, and another nodded quickly, eager to agree, eager to believe. But the old man from the general store did not move from his chair, did not join their relief, his gaze fixed on that same ridge, watching not what was there, but what was not, because the birds that usually circled above the rise were gone. The wind that usually brushed through the dry grass had stilled, and the silence carried a weight that did not belong to empty land. Then, slowly, almost too slow to notice at first, shapes began to form along the horizon, dark against the growing light, not moving in the way cattle moved, not scattered like riders passing through, but still, aligned, deliberate. One became 5, 5 became 20, and within the span of a few breaths, the ridge that had looked empty now held a line of figures that stretched farther than any one man could count. No voices carried down, no movement broke their formation, and yet every person in town felt it at the same moment, a quiet shift that pressed against the chest and settled deep. Crow straightened without realizing it, his fingers tightening just slightly, eyes narrowing as he tried to make sense of what he was seeing. But sense did not come easy when something had already been decided long before it arrived. The boy from the night before stood beside his grandfather, now, eyes wide, watching the figures take shape, and though he did not understand what he was looking at, he understood enough to stay silent. "Do not speak," the old man said softly, not looking down, his voice carrying the kind of certainty that did not need explanation. The line on the ridge did not advance, did not threaten, did not break. It simply remained, steady as stone, as if the land itself had risen and taken form. And then, from the center of that stillness, one figure stepped forward, moving with a calm that drew every eye without effort, descending the slope at an even pace, not hurried, not hesitant, until she reached the lower ground where light fully revealed her. She stood tall, shoulders straight, dark hair pulled back, her presence carrying something older than the town itself, something that did not need to announce itself to be understood. Her eyes moved once across Red Hollow, not searching, not questioning, simply seeing, and when she spoke, her voice carried clear through the morning air without being raised. "The man you sent away," she said, each word placed with quiet precision, "does not belong to you." And the silence that followed was heavier than anything that had come before, because in that moment, every man who had stood watching the fire the day before felt the ground beneath him shift in a way that had nothing to do with earth and everything to do with truth that had just begun to surface. No one in Red Hollow moved after she spoke, not because they had been told to stay still, but because something in her voice had already made the choice for them. And Sheriff Dalton Crow felt it first, a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with something slipping out of his control. He stepped forward anyway, boots pressing into the dirt with forced confidence, chin lifted just enough to remind himself who he was in this town. And when he spoke, his voice carried, but not as far as hers had. "That man walked away on his own," he said, each word measured, as if careful language could shape reality. "No one here forced him." And a few men behind him nodded too quickly, eager to stand on something solid, even if it shifted beneath them. The woman listened without interruption, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady on Crow as though she had heard words like his before and found them lacking every time. When she answered, she did not raise her voice, yet it reached every ear. "A man does not walk away from his home without reason," she said, and the weight of that sentence settled deeper than any accusation could have. Behind her, the line on the ridge remained unbroken, figures still, as carved stone, watching, waiting, not with impatience, but with certainty, and that certainty began to press into the town like a slow tide. The old man by the store finally stood, his joints stiff, but his gaze clear, stepping just enough into the street that others noticed, though he did not look at them, only at the woman. "The mark he carried," he said quietly. It was not his to take, and for the first time, a flicker passed through her expression, not surprise, but recognition, like a door opening just slightly. She inclined her head once, a gesture small but deliberate. "It was given," she replied, "earned when he chose to stand where others turned away." And murmurs moved through the gathered townsfolk, low and uncertain, because no one in Red Hollow had ever seen Elias Boone stand for anything except his own quiet life. Crow's jaw tightened, his hand shifting against his belt as if searching for something that was not there. "You are saying he belongs to you," he said. And now there was an edge in his voice, not sharp, but strained, "that he answers to your people." And the question hung between them, heavier than it sounded, because if the answer was yes, then everything that had happened the day before had been built on a mistake too large to name. The woman took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to make the air between them feel thinner. "He does not belong to us," she said, each word clear, unhurried. "He chose us when there was no reason to." And the distinction landed like a stone in still water, rippling outward through every man and woman listening. The boy who had held the charred fragment the night before glanced up at his grandfather, eyes searching for something to hold on to, and the old man only gave the slightest shake of his head, as if to say that some truths did not come with comfort. Crow let out a breath he had not meant to release, his confidence slipping not in one moment, but in small pieces, each one harder to reclaim than the last. "Then why are you here?" he asked, quieter now, though he tried to hide it. "If he walked away, then this is done." And for the first time, the woman's gaze shifted past him, sweeping across the town, taking in the buildings, the people, the faint traces of smoke still clinging to the air. And when she spoke again, it was not just to him, but to all of them. "Because what you think is done," she said, "has only just begun." And the silence that followed was no longer uncertain, it was knowing, as if every person standing there understood, without needing it explained, that the story they thought had ended in ashes had only been the beginning of something they could no longer control. The air did not move after her words settled, not a breeze, not a whisper, as if even the wind understood this moment did not belong to it. And Sheriff Dalton Crow felt every pair of eyes shift, not toward the woman, but toward him, waiting, measuring, asking a question no one dared to say out loud. He cleared his throat, a small sound that carried more than he intended, and straightened again, pulling what remained of his authority around him like a coat that no longer fit quite right. You speak like this town owes something, he said, slower now, careful. But that man never said a word to anyone, never asked for help, never made himself known, and it sounded reasonable. When he said it, simple even, the kind of logic that usually held things together. But the woman did not answer right away, and that silence worked against him more than any argument could have. She looked past him again, not dismissing him, but placing him where he belonged, a part of something larger he did not yet understand. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried something deeper now, something that did not ask to be believed, only to be heard. Some men do not speak of what they have done, she said, because they did not do it to be known. And the words settled over the town like dust after a long ride, quiet but impossible to ignore. The old man by the store nodded once, slow, as if confirming something he had suspected but never wanted to see proven, while the boy beside him tightened his grip on his sleeve, sensing the shift without fully understanding it. Crow's eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in resistance, because accepting this meant stepping into ground he could not control. Then say it plainly, he replied, a hint of strain beneath the surface. What did he do that brings all of you here? And this time, the woman did not look at the town, did not measure their reactions. She looked only at him, and for a moment, the distance between them felt smaller than the space suggested. He stood alone, she said, when our people were being turned away from water that had always been there, when fear had made others forget what was right. And a murmur passed through the crowd, faint, uneasy, because stories like that had a way of touching things people preferred to leave buried. He did not ask who we were, she continued, her voice steady. He did not measure worth by color or by name. He simply stepped forward and chose to do what others would not. And now the silence deepened, not from uncertainty, but from recognition, because even those who had never seen Elias Boone in such a moment could picture it, could see the kind of man who would act without witness and walk away without claim. Crow shifted his weight, the ground beneath him no different than before, yet somehow less certain. And that makes him one of you, he said. Quieter now, as if testing the idea and finding no solid edge to hold. The woman shook her head once, a small movement, but firm. It makes him a man who understands something your town has forgotten, she said, and the words did not accuse. They revealed, and that made them harder to dismiss. Behind her, the line on the ridge remained still, but now their presence felt less like a threat and more like a truth made visible, something that had always existed just beyond the edge of sight. The boy looked up again at his grandfather, and this time the old man spoke, low enough that only those closest could hear. We thought he was alone, he said, but a man like that never is. And Crow heard it, even if it was not meant for him. And for the first time since the fire, he did not have an answer ready, because the story he had told himself about Elias Boone no longer held its shape. And in its place stood something far more difficult to face, a man they had dismissed, a man they had taken from, a man who had never needed them to begin with, and yet had chosen to stand where they would not. And now, whatever came next was no longer about land or ownership or power. It was about something quieter, something heavier, something that did not need to raise its voice to be heard. The town did not breathe the same way after that, not in the open, not in the quiet spaces between footsteps, because something had shifted that no one could pretend not to feel anymore. And Sheriff Dalton Crow stood there longer than he should have, eyes fixed on the woman as if waiting for her to demand something he could refuse, something he could fight, something that would return the world to a shape he understood. But she did not demand, she did not threaten, she simply waited, and that waiting carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. Crow finally spoke again, slower now, each word pulled through resistance. If he did what you say, he said, then why did he never come to us, never say a word? And the question hung there, not as a challenge, but as a man trying to find ground beneath his feet. The woman's gaze did not harden, did not soften. It remained steady, as if she had already walked through this moment before it arrived. Because he knew what you would see, she answered, and it would not be what he was. And that truth landed quietly, but it stayed, settling into the cracks of every assumption the town had built about the man they thought they understood. A breeze finally moved through the street, light but noticeable, carrying dust across boots and porch steps, and with it came a sound from the ridge, not loud, not sharp, but unmistakable, the soft shift of many horses adjusting their stance at once, leather creaking, hooves pressing into earth, a presence that did not need to move forward to be felt. The boy stepped closer to his grandfather without thinking, eyes drawn to the line on the hill. "Are they going to come down?" he whispered, and the old man did not answer right away, his gaze still fixed on the woman below, measuring something deeper than distance. "They do not need to," he finally said, voice low. "They already have." And the meaning of that settled deeper than the words themselves. Crow heard it too, even if he did not want to, and for the first time, he looked past the woman, up toward the ridge, really looked, not as a sheriff counting numbers, but as a man realizing the scale of something he had misjudged, and what he saw was not anger, not chaos, but order, patience, and something that did not bend easily. He turned back, slower now, his voice quieter. When he spoke again, "Then what is it you want?" And this time, there was no edge left, only the question itself. The woman stepped forward one more pace, closing the space just enough that her presence felt undeniable. "Nothing that was not already yours to give," she said, and the simplicity of it struck harder than any demand could have, because it left no room for negotiation, no space to hide behind words. The old man shifted his weight, the boards beneath his boots creaking softly, and, for a moment, it seemed like the entire town leaned toward that answer without moving. Crow's hand dropped from his belt, fingers loosening as if releasing something he had been holding too tightly. "You are asking for the land," he said, but even as he spoke, it sounded smaller than the truth. The woman shook her head once, slow, certain. "The land was never the question," she replied. "It is the man." And now the silence that followed was different, not heavy with fear, but with understanding beginning to take shape, because somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the line of still figures and the edge of sight, Elias Boone was still out there, still walking the same ground he had left behind, carrying nothing that belonged to this town, and yet everything that now stood waiting for him. And in that moment, Red Hollow realized something it had not known how to name before, that what they had taken could not be measured in acres or fences, and what stood before them now was not here to take anything back. It was here to show them what they had already lost. No one spoke after that, not because they had nothing to say, but because whatever words they might have used no longer seemed enough, and Sheriff Dalton Crow stood in the middle of his own town, feeling something unfamiliar settle into his chest. Not fear, not quite regret, but something closer to realization, the kind that comes too late to change what has already been done. He looked past the woman again, up toward the ridge, and this time he did not count the figures, did not measure their number like a threat to be handled. He saw them for what they were, not advancing, not demanding, simply present, like a truth that had come to stand where it could no longer be ignored. The old man by the store shifted forward, stepping fully into the street now, his voice carrying just enough to reach those closest. "You cannot fix this with words," he said, not accusing, not advising, just stating, and Crow heard it, even if he did not respond. A few men behind him exchanged glances, the kind that pass silently between people who begin to understand they are no longer standing on the same ground they thought they were, and one of them removed his hat without realizing it, fingers tightening along the brim as if holding on to something that might slip away. The boy looked up again at his grandfather. "Then what happens now?" he asked, voice barely above a whisper, and the old man did not answer right away, because answers like that did not come quickly, not when they mattered. The woman took another slow step forward, stopping just short of where the line between town and open land seemed to exist, though no one had ever marked it. And she looked at Crow, not with anger, not with expectation, but with something steadier, something that waited for him to understand on his own. "You cannot return what you took from him with land," she said, and the words did not rise, did not fall. They simply remained. But you can decide what kind of men you are when he returns. And that was the first time she spoke of him coming back, not as a possibility, but as something already set in motion. Crow's gaze dropped for a fraction of a second, just enough that those closest noticed, and when he lifted it again, it was different, not weaker, but less certain, as if the ground beneath him had shifted in a way he could no longer deny. He may not come back, Crow said, though the words lacked conviction even as he spoke them, and the woman's response came without hesitation. Men like him always do, she said, and the certainty in her voice left no room for doubt. A breeze moved through the town again, carrying with it the faint scent of distant sage and something else, something clean that did not belong to smoke or ash. And for the first time since the fire, the air felt different, not lighter, but clearer, as if something had been stripped away. The old man nodded once, almost to himself. He will come, he said quietly, and this time, the boy did not ask why, because he could feel it too, the way a story moves toward its ending even before anyone speaks it out loud. Crow exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just slightly, not in defeat, but in something closer to acceptance, and when he looked back at the woman, there was no argument left in his eyes, only the weight of what stood between what had been done and what could still be chosen. Behind her, the line on the ridge remained, still as ever, but no longer distant in the way it had been before, because now every man in Red Hollow understood that distance was not measured in miles, it was measured in understanding, and that gap had already begun to close. Somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the line of sight and the reach of the town, a single rider moved along a quiet stretch of land, unhurried, steady, carrying nothing that tied him back except the truth waiting ahead, and though no one in Red Hollow could yet see him, they felt it all the same. The slow, inevitable return of a man they had never truly known, and the quiet question of who they would be when he finally stepped back into view. By the time the sun climbed higher, Red Hollow had stopped pretending this was just another morning, because no one returned to their usual routines, no one opened the shop doors with their usual rhythm, no one spoke loud enough to break the thin layer of tension stretched across the town like wire, and Sheriff Dalton Crow remained where he stood, not out of stubbornness now, but because moving felt like choosing something he was not yet ready to name. The woman had not moved either, her presence steady at the edge of the town, neither crossing into it nor stepping back from it, as if she understood that this moment did not belong to action, it belonged to recognition. A man from the far end of the street shifted forward, hat in hand, his voice uncertain as he spoke. If he comes back, what then? And the question drifted through the stillness, not directed at anyone, but heard by all. The old man by the store glanced toward him, then back to the woman, and it was she who answered, her voice calm, measured. Then he will see what you have chosen to become. And that answer carried something heavier than any instruction, because it placed the weight not on her people, not on the line of riders beyond the ridge, but on the town itself. Crow drew a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly to the dust at his feet, where boot prints overlapped in patterns that spoke of movement without direction. And for the first time since the fire, he looked not at the land, not at the ridge, but at the people behind him, really looked, seeing the uncertainty in their posture, the quiet doubt in their eyes, the way no one stood as firmly as they had the day before. We thought he was just a man keeping to himself, someone muttered, more to the ground than to the crowd, and another voice followed, softer. We never asked why. And those small admissions carried farther than any declaration, because they came without defense. The boy stepped forward half a pace, then stopped, as if crossing some invisible line, his voice low but clear. He never spoke much, he said, but he always nodded when people passed. And it was a simple memory, almost nothing, yet it landed with a quiet force, because it reminded them that the man they had dismissed had never closed himself off completely. It was them who had chosen not to look closer. The woman listened to all of it without interruption, her gaze moving once across the town again, not judging, not forgiving, simply witnessing. And when she spoke, it was not to correct them, but to place something where it had been missing. A man can stand alone, she said, and still carry more than a town together. And the truth of that settled deep, because it did not accuse, it revealed. Crow straightened slowly, not in defiance, but in something closer to decision, his voice quieter when he spoke again. "If he returns," he said, choosing each word carefully now, "then this town will not turn him away." And though it was not loud, not grand, it carried through the stillness with a weight that felt different, because it was no longer spoken from authority, but from understanding beginning to take shape. The old man nodded once, approving not the words alone, but the shift behind them, while the others remained silent, letting the moment settle, letting it take hold where it needed to. The breeze moved again, softer this time, carrying the scent of open land instead of smoke. And for the first time since the fire, it did not feel like something pressing down, but something passing through. Beyond the ridge, the line of riders remained, unchanged, but no longer distant in meaning, because now every person in Red Hollow understood that what stood there was not waiting to act, it was waiting to see, and somewhere beyond that line, on a stretch of quiet land that had not yet been touched by any of this, Elias Boone rode on without hurry, unaware of the shift already taking place behind him, unaware that the silence he carried had already begun to speak louder than any words he had ever chosen not to say. The sun had passed its peak by the time the first real movement happened, not from the ridge, not from the woman standing at the edge of town, but from within Red Hollow itself, where small decisions began to take shape in quiet ways that no one announced, yet everyone noticed. Sheriff Dalton Crow was the first to turn, slow and deliberate, his boots pressing into the dust as he walked back toward the blackened remains at the far end of the street. And for a moment no one followed, not because they did not want to, but because they were waiting to see if he truly meant it. He stopped where the fence line had once stood, where charred posts leaned at angles that spoke of something unfinished, and he stood there without speaking, looking at what had been taken as if seeing it for the first time, without the weight of ownership attached. Then he bent, not with haste, but with purpose, and lifted one of the fallen beams, setting it upright against another, a small action, almost nothing. But in a town like this, it carried further than a shouted order ever could. One man stepped forward next, then another, each one moving without instruction, without needing to be told, hands finding what needed to be lifted, cleared, set aside, not rebuilding yet, but beginning. The boy watched from the edge of the street, eyes following every movement, and when his grandfather placed a hand on his shoulder and nodded once, he stepped forward too, smaller hands brushing ash from wood that no longer held heat, his movements careful, as if he understood that this was not about fixing, but about acknowledging. The woman remained where she stood, her gaze steady, observing not the work itself, but the intention behind it. And though she did not move, something in her presence shifted, not softer, not lighter, but more still, as if what she had come to see was beginning to unfold. Behind her, the line on the ridge did not change, yet there was a subtle movement among them, not forward, not downward, but a slight easing, like a breath taken after a long hold. Crow wiped his hands against his coat, leaving dark streaks where clean fabric had been, and for the first time, he did not seem to notice, his focus remaining on the ground before him, on the shape of something that could be set right in a way that did not erase what had happened but did not deny it either. "We cannot undo it," one of the men said, quietly, and Crow nodded once, not looking up. "No," he replied, "but we can decide what stands here next." And the words carried a different kind of authority now, one that did not come from position, but from acceptance. The old man watched from where he stood, a faint line easing from his brow as he took in the shift, not as a solution, but as a beginning, and the boy beside him worked without speaking, his small movements steady, deliberate, like someone learning something that could not be taught in words. The breeze moved again, carrying dust and the faint scent of something new, not smoke, not ash, but open earth disturbed and turned, and for the first time since the fire, the town did not feel like it was holding its breath. Somewhere beyond the ridge, beyond the still figures and the line that had drawn itself across the land, a rider slowed his horse, not because he had seen the town, not because he knew what had changed, but because something in the air ahead felt different, like a path that had shifted without leaving a mark. Elias Boone lifted his gaze once toward the distant rise, eyes narrowing slightly, as if listening to something too quiet to name. And though he did not turn back, not yet, the space between where he was and where he had come from no longer felt the same, as if something there had begun to call him in a way it never had before. By late afternoon, the shape of the land at the edge of Red Hollow had begun to change, not in size, not in distance, but in meaning, because where there had been nothing but ash that morning, there now stood the outline of something being remembered, not rebuilt in haste, but carefully acknowledged piece by piece. Sheriff Dalton Crow stood with the others, no longer apart from them, sleeves rolled, hands marked with dust and soot that he did not bother to wipe away anymore. His movements slower than the younger men, but steady, deliberate, as if each motion mattered more than the result. No one spoke much while they worked, not because they had nothing to say, but because words felt smaller than what was taking place. And for the first time, the silence in Red Hollow was not heavy. It was focused. The boy carried small boards one at a time, placing them where his grandfather showed him, learning the weight of things not by size, but by meaning, and each time he set one down, he looked toward the ridge, not with fear now, but with awareness, as if understanding that what stood there was watching not what they had done, but what they were choosing now. The woman had not moved from her place, yet something about her presence felt closer, not in distance, but in connection, like a line that had been drawn without being seen was slowly fading. Behind her, the riders remained, their stillness unchanged, but no longer distant in purpose, because now every action in the town below had become part of what they had come to witness. Crow paused at one point, resting a hand against an upright post they had managed to set back into place, and he looked across the open stretch where the cabin had once stood, his gaze lingering longer than before, not calculating, not claiming, but measuring something he had never considered until now. He built this alone, one man said quietly, almost to himself, and Crow nodded once, his voice low when he answered, yes, and we thought that made him small, and the truth of that hung there, not accusing, but undeniable. The old man stepped forward then, leaning slightly on his cane, eyes moving across the structure taking shape. A man who builds something without asking for help does not mean he has none, he said, and this time, no one argued, no one dismissed it, because they had begun to see it for themselves. The breeze shifted again, warmer now, carrying the scent of earth that had been turned, wood that had been handled, and something else, something quieter, something that felt like the beginning of a change not yet complete. Beyond the ridge, a subtle movement passed through the line of riders, not a step forward, not a sign of departure, but something like acknowledgement, as if what they had come for was unfolding as it needed to. Far from the town, where the land stretched wide and unbroken, Elias Boone slowed his horse once more, the animal responding to something its rider had not yet named, and he turned his head slightly, just enough to glance back over his shoulder, not fully, not with intention, but with a hesitation that had not been there before. The wind touched his face differently now, carrying with it a trace of something familiar, not smoke, not ash, but something that spoke of change rather than loss. And though he did not turn around, not yet, the distance behind him no longer felt like something closed. It felt like something waiting, back in Red Hollow. Crow stepped away from the post and looked toward the edge of town where the woman stood, and for the first time since she arrived, he did not see her as someone standing outside of them, but as someone holding a place between what had been and what could be, and in that space, something quiet and undeniable began to take root, not forced, not demanded, but chosen, one action at a time, one decision after another, until the town itself no longer looked the same to those who stood within it. The sun dipped lower, stretching long shadows across the half-cleared ground where something new was beginning to take shape, and for the first time since the fire, Red Hollow did not look like a place that had taken something. It looked like a place trying to understand what it had lost. The structure was still incomplete, no walls yet, no roof, only upright beams and the outline of intention. But it stood straighter than anything that had been there that morning, because it was no longer built from ownership, it was built from choice. Sheriff Dalton Crow stepped back from the frame, breathing slow, his chest rising and falling with a weight that had changed, not lighter, but clearer, and when he turned, he did not look at the land first. He looked at the people, at the men who had followed without being told, at the boy who still carried boards too big for his hands, at the old man who had not left his place since morning, and for the first time, he understood that whatever stood here next would not belong to him alone. The woman watched it all, her posture unchanged, yet something in her gaze had shifted, not softened, but settled, as if the question she had brought with her was beginning to answer itself. Behind her, the line on the ridge no longer felt like a wall. It felt like a witness, steady and patient, present without pressure. The breeze moved again, brushing through the open frame, carrying the scent of wood touched by human hands, and it no longer carried the bitterness of ash. One of the men wiped his brow and looked toward Crow, hesitating before speaking. If he comes back, does this belong to him? And the question held no challenge, only uncertainty. Crow did not answer right away, his gaze moving slowly across the structure, across the land, and then toward the edge of town where the woman stood. And when he spoke, his voice was quieter than it had ever been. It was always his, he said. We just did not see it. And that truth settled deep, not as an admission of fault, but as recognition finally catching up to reality. The old man gave a small nod, his eyes closing for a brief moment, as if something inside him had finally aligned. The boy looked up at the frame, then out toward the ridge, and for the first time, he smiled slightly, not from joy, but from understanding something he had not known how to name before. Far beyond the town, the rider who had not yet turned slowed again, his horse shifting beneath him as if sensing the change in direction before it was chosen. And this time, Elias Boone did turn, not sharply, not with urgency, but with quiet certainty, guiding his horse in a slow arc that faced back toward the land he had left behind. He did not rush, did not push the animal forward. He simply allowed it to move, one step at a time, as if returning was not a reaction, but a decision that had always been waiting. The wind met him differently now, carrying no trace of smoke, only the open scent of distance closing. And though he could not yet see Red Hollow, something in him recognized it, the way a man recognizes a place not by sight, but by the weight it carries in his chest. Back in the town, Crow lifted his head slightly, as if feeling something shift beyond the ridge, and though he said nothing, those closest to him felt it too, a quiet change in the air that did not come from the wind, but from something approaching. The woman turned her gaze once more toward the horizon, not searching, not questioning, simply knowing, and behind her, the line on the ridge remained still, not because they had nothing to do, but because everything that mattered was already in motion. And in that stillness, in that space between what had been done and what was now being chosen, Red Hollow stood waiting, not for judgment, not for punishment, but for the return of a man who had never asked anything from them, and yet had changed everything they now understood about themselves. The light began to fade into that quiet hour between day and night, when everything slows just enough for truth to settle where it belongs. And Red Hollow stood in that stillness, no longer restless, no longer uncertain, but waiting with a kind of calm that had not existed there before. The frame of the ranch stood outlined against the dimming sky, simple, unfinished, but honest in a way nothing in that town had been just a day before. And Sheriff Dalton Crow remained near it, not guarding it, not claiming it, but standing beside it like a man who finally understood his place in something larger than himself. No one had left, not fully, not yet, as if the entire town knew that leaving now would mean missing something that mattered more than anything they had seen before. The boy sat on a low beam, legs dangling, his small hands resting on wood that no longer carried the heat of destruction but the quiet warmth of effort. And beside him, the old man leaned lightly on his cane, eyes fixed on the horizon, not searching, just waiting. The woman had not moved far, yet as the light shifted, her presence seemed to blend with the land itself, as if she belonged to it in a way that did not need to be explained. And behind her, the riders on the ridge remained, not as a threat, not as a force, but as something steady and certain, a line that did not need to cross into the town to be felt within it. Then, without announcement, without urgency, a single shape appeared at the far edge of the land beyond the ridge, small at first, barely more than a shadow against the fading light, but moving with a rhythm that did not belong to chance. No one pointed, no one spoke, yet slowly, one by one, heads turned, eyes narrowing, recognizing something before it could be fully seen. Sheriff Crow felt it before he confirmed it, his posture straightening slightly, his breath slowing as if preparing for something that had already begun. The boy stood without being told, his gaze fixed on the distant figure, and the old man gave a small nod, as if acknowledging something that had always been inevitable. The woman watched without surprise, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady on the approaching rider, not as if she were seeing him for the first time, but as if she had known this moment long before it arrived. The distance closed slowly, measured not in miles but in recognition, and as the shape became clearer, as the outline of a horse and rider took form against the dim horizon, the town did not move to meet him, did not rush forward, because something in them understood that this was not a moment to interrupt, it was a moment to receive. Elias Boone rode with the same steady pace he had left with, nothing hurried, nothing forced, his silhouette unchanged, his presence quiet, yet carrying something that now reached beyond himself. He did not look toward the ridge, did not acknowledge the line of riders who had come for him, because he did not need to. Their presence was not for him. It was for what had happened in his absence. As he drew closer, the details returned, the worn hat, the dust along his coat, the stillness in the way he held himself, and yet something was different, not in him, but in what stood waiting ahead, the frame of the ranch, the people gathered, the space that had once been empty, now holding something that had been missing before, and for a brief moment, just before he reached the edge of town, Elias slowed his horse, not from hesitation, but from awareness, as if feeling the change before stepping into it. The wind moved softly through the open land, carrying no smoke, no ash, only the quiet scent of something restored not in structure, but in meaning. And in that moment, Red Hollow did not stand as a town that had taken, but as a place that had begun, finally, to understand what it meant to give. No one stepped forward when Elias Boone reached the edge of Red Hollow, not because they feared him, but because something in them understood that this was not a moment to meet him halfway. It was a moment to stand where they had chosen to stand and let him see it for himself. His horse slowed to a quiet stop just beyond the first line of buildings, hooves settling into the dust with a soft, steady sound. And Elias remained seated for a breath longer than needed, his eyes moving across the town. Not with suspicion, not with expectation, but with the same quiet attention he had always carried. He saw the people first, gathered but not crowded, present but not pressing, and then his gaze moved past them, toward the open stretch of land where his ranch had once stood, where now the frame rose against the fading light. Simple, unfinished, but unmistakable. He did not react in the way most men would. There was no sharp intake of breath, no sudden movement, only a slight stillness, as if something inside him had paused to take measure of what stood before him. Sheriff Dalton Crow stepped forward then, not fast, not slow, his posture no longer carrying the weight of authority, but something steadier, something earned in the quiet hours that had passed, and when he stopped a few steps away, he removed his hat, holding it in both hands without looking down. "We did not understand," Crow said, his voice clear but low, not reaching for more than it needed to. "And what we did cannot be undone." And he let the words stand there without trying to shape them into something easier. Elias listened without interrupting, his gaze steady, unreadable, not cold, not warm, simply present. Crow continued after a moment. "But this town has chosen what stands here now." And he turned slightly, not as a gesture of display, but of acknowledgement, toward the frame rising behind him. The silence that followed was not empty. It held everything that had been said and everything that had not. And in that space, Elias finally shifted, swinging one leg over and stepping down from his horse with the same quiet movement he had always used, boots meeting the ground without sound. He did not walk immediately, did not close the distance at once. Instead, he reached into his coat and drew out the half-burned leather cord, the turquoise stone catching the last light of day. And for a moment, he looked at it, not as an object, but as something that carried weight beyond itself. Then he lifted his gaze, not to Crow, not to the town, but toward the woman standing at the edge, and she met it with the same calm certainty she had held since she arrived. No words passed between them. None were needed. because what stood between them had already been spoken in actions that stretched beyond this moment. Elias nodded once, small, almost imperceptible, and the woman returned the gesture, just as slight, and behind her, the line on the ridge shifted for the first time, not forward, not downward, but easing, like a breath released after a long hold. Elias turned then, his attention returning to the frame, to the land, to the shape of something that had been lost, and was now being offered back in a way that did not erase what had happened, but did not deny it either. He took a few steps forward, slow, measured, stopping just at the edge of the new structure, his hand lifting briefly to touch one of the upright beams, fingers resting against the wood as if feeling not its strength, but the intention behind it. No one spoke, no one moved, because they understood that whatever came next did not belong to them to decide. After a moment, Elias let his hand fall, his gaze sweeping once more across the people gathered there, and though his expression did not change, something in his eyes did, not forgiveness, not approval, but recognition, and that was enough. He turned back to his horse, taking hold of the reins without hurry, and as he did, the woman stepped back, not in retreat, but in completion, her role in this moment fulfilled without needing to be declared. The riders on the ridge began to fade into the dimming light, not vanishing, not fleeing, simply no longer needing to remain. And Red Hollow stood in their absence not as a town that had been judged, but as one that had been seen. Elias mounted his horse once more, not leaving, not yet, but settling into the quiet space between what had been and what would come. And as the last light slipped beyond the horizon, the town did not speak, did not celebrate, did not reach for anything more than what had already been given, because out here, in the wide and patient silence of the West, justice did not need a voice. It only needed a man willing to stand, and a town willing to learn how to stand beside him.